So the focus of this particular session is on new human development path in the entrepreneurial age. And if you think about what we've just heard over the past two panels, there seems to be a consensus around, although I'm at risk using that word, but there seems to be a consensus around the deconstruction of organizations, the deconstruction of value chains, you know, the nature of the system is changing profoundly as a result of technology and this need to develop different types of experiences and fill in the blanks with knowledge we don't have. And throughout all of this, there's the assumption that people are ready, willing, and able to learn to be able to do this. So the second panel, I guess it was the first panel, Stowe and Yolanda said it's really tough to do this. So our guest today, besides Simone, is Indy, who you just heard a minute ago, probably has the best radio voice I've ever heard, has also done a lot. Boy, am I envious. Has also done a lot of other things. He's an architect. Someone's called him a firework of ideas. He's the co-founder of the 00 Research Laboratory, Skunk Works, Dark Matter. I mean, the list goes on. And he's been a recent guest on Simone's, on the Boundaryless podcast series. And the thing that was so interesting there, Indy, if I can recall, but I'm not going to get the words right, but the way you talked about the situation that we're in at the moment is that the pace of human development is sort of plateaued or at least stalled, while the pace of machinery and technology and presumably growing customer expectations continues to grow exponentially. Do I have that right? And could you elaborate a little bit on that and why it's so important?
Yeah, no, firstly, thank you. And it's an honor to be here. I think it's a really important conversation at multiple levels, I suppose. The hypothesis I want to put forward is that actually there's a conception of being human, which has plateaued. And we have constructed our whole society on a particular conception of being human, which is a human which is effectively extrinsically motivated and extrinsically structured. So you could argue that our thesis of organizing humanity is actually, there is a thing called democracy, but actually most of our work in production thesis is still organized through the thesis of management. And management, you could quite comfortably draw a line between management and the rule of kings in a very linear way, missing out the whole thesis of democracy quite comfortably.
Right.
And when you sort of take that line, I think what I would want to put forward is that we have reached a limit in that system, and it's actually fundamentally limiting our capacity to see the world. So the extrinsic models, the mechanisms of how we incentivize, say, science or culture, these things are limiting our capacity to actually operationalize and see different visions of the universe. In fact, I think it's limiting our capacity to perhaps even go beyond sort of 19, E is equal to MC squared. Those kind of conceptions of the universe are now being limited by actually the models that we've created. And because of short-term thinking structures, because of our incentive structures that we've generated, all these mechanisms are effectively limiting it. At the same time, at a structural level, there is a huge gap between what I would argue is the scientific and the science-based comprehension and the philosophical comprehension of what it means to be human, and our policy and political landscape of what it means to, and economic landscape of what it means to be human. That chasm has massively grown. So even if you look at the work of David Bohm and actually quantum physicists and other people that were looking at this stuff, we were increasingly in the 1970s starting to talk about a great entanglement. Yet our economy and our politics is really still locked into an Enlightenment model of thinking, which is about individualism, discreteness, which is, I think, limiting our capacity. And at the same time, it's not recognizing our interdependence at a global scale and as well as a local scale, our environmental interdependence as a result of our say, the microbiomes, or whether it's actually micropollutants or microstressors, which actually distort our DNA and effectively epigenetically, actually those are passed through to our children. And this, all these kind of our fundamental interdependence is ignored. And those interdependents are now feedbacking as micro level stressors, micro level environmental pollutants, which are fundamentally undermining our capacity to grow. So I think there's a micro level problem, there's a structural problem, and then there is a kind of potential problem. So everywhere I talk, everyone talks about mental health, but what they're really talking about is deficit management. We're not yet imagining what would be the extraordinary capacity of being human in a new age. So I would want to make an analogy as a mechanism to start to think about this differently, which is that in the 19th century, we talked about public health, and the investment in public health, the slum clearances, various other things happened because we recognized that we needed a new physical health, a tangible and intangible quality of physical health had to be brought to bear if we're going to unlock an industrial economy. If we want to create the next human economy, and this is where I'm going to link back to some of the stuff that Simone was saying, if we want to unlock a new human economy and a new humane economy, which is based on care, high performance cognition, and craft orientation, we're going to have to build a new capacity, a new institutional capacity to invest and reform all the environmental conditions to drive that. So those are two components. And then it does also fundamentally throw up for me is a care, high performance cognitive and craft economy, have they got anything to do with markets? And I wonder whether markets are a thesis and a function of actually a machined, robotic and extrinsically orientated thesis of how society is organized, and whether we need to start to think fundamentally differently, where the analogy of markets, and I think it's a kind of semiotic thesis, which is actually fundamentally broken and has reached the end of our cycle. So I suppose that's the two contributions I'd make. I'd say there's something at the structural level, but I think it starts to then question what our de facto thesis is, which is the thesis of resource allocation through markets, which may be much more problematic. The employment contract we have is a thesis of slavery still. It's a thesis of control. It doesn't embody free speech or free rights. Our whole institutional architecture has been evolved around that. Our thesis with land is actually a thesis of control. Property rights are about the benefits, to all the benefits of that piece of land. So they're derivative rights. They turn land into a resource, not we are in treaty with land. Our thesis with the future is a thesis of control. So all these things are linked together into a thesis of control in an age of enlightenment versus a thesis of entanglement and ennoblement, which I think is a fundamentally different thesis. With that, I'll perhaps open up. I mean, that opens up some of the kind of fields and require I'd respond with.
Simone, do you want to respond, or?
I think I had a fascination to share with you both that comes to my mind. In the lately you spoke about, for example, the role of DLTs, so digital ledger technologies such as Holochain, for example, in democratizing contracting. So and in this process, enabling what you call, if I'm not wrong, a transition between the private economy into the civic economy. And I'm really interested in this point, if you can expand how this is related with this new economy of essentials that we are supposed to start dealing more intentionally with. And coming back to this intentionality, my question is really about, to some extent, to what extent is this change going to be driven by the technology and also the organizational models that we choose, or it's going to be driven from the moral aspects that you seem to mention when you talk about some of the changes that you highlight. So I think I want to close. I want to quote Wendell Berry when he points out that change can be delegated to organizations only to a certain extent. So part of the change is about us. It's about how we situate ourselves in the world, and maybe to really redraw the human development thesis, there is some profound change in perception that we need to go through. I don't know. That's something that I bring on the table.
Indy,
Yeah,
you need to.
thank you. Yeah, thank you. So so many different things there. Let me try to hit them one by one. One, I think there is something fundamental going on, which Arthur spoke about, but also many people have spoken about, which is I think we're seeing a transition from a private economy, and the private economy, which is a function between the efficacy and the efficiency of making contracts, was limited to two people. And your idea of creating massive multi-agent contracts in an analog economy was fundamentally limited through the cost of bureaucracy, the cost of negotiation, and various other things. And as Arthur rightly said, that when you start to build micro smart contracting, very micro, and you start to have these contracts link in any format, you fundamentally start to change the architecture of participation to no longer be bilateral, but actually start to be massively multilateral. And that starts to change the architecture of how value is structured. And I think this, I'll give you two very stupid examples, but I think they start to illustrate the point. So the High Line, we've done some work, it's online. We've been exploring the New York High Line, which has been an extraordinary success in terms of cultural effect and impact. It's been extraordinary to watch, but what was even more extraordinary is the High Line in 10 months increased land value of associated land, so much so that if you just took 10% of the land value uplift in 10 months, you would have paid for the whole High Line. Because the civic asset of the High Line creates a spillover value, and which is that spillover value is largely captured by adjacent land, privately owned land. It is now possible to construct business models which look at the capture of that intangible, that value, and start to actually proportionally reinvest that back into civic assets. So when you can start to do massive multi-actor contracting into the center, you start to create, I think, a different value formation thesis, which is massively multi-actor and thereby transcends the thesis of private interest and public interest into a new civic thesis. And that's kind of where I think the kind of contractual landscape is opening up a new economic landscape, which I think will be much more significant in the 21st century. That's one aspect. I suppose the second question was, there's quite a few questions in there, Simone, but the second question was around the kind of the human development potential and
how much this deals with the individual, I mean, no? So not just with the organization and the technology, but also with the individual.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, well, I think this deals with, so I think what is becoming increasingly apparent to me is societies that have not dealt with some of the social, whether it's gender or whether it's race or these issues, leave a huge obstacle for corporations to deal with, because those manifest into those realities. So you're absolutely right to say some of this stuff has to be dealt with at a societal scale. I think some of those things are there. I think some of these things have to be dealt with at an organizational scale. I do think there is the thesis of kind of self is, I don't personally believe this is a moral argument. And I think it's a fundamentally new form of value. So, the High Line, if you constructed that business model, is the best business model in real estate. So I don't think this is a thesis of kind of a moral economy in that sense. I think this is an economy through its interdependence is moral. It is in itself a better morality than where we are now, and thereby self-replicates. And I think that's the way I would like to go. I think you're right to say that the cultural, this is a structural transition. And I think one of the biggest challenges we face, certainly in the West, is that actually our language structures. So, for example, English. Let's use that as English is 80% nouns. Our conception of the world is entirely driven through object-oriented thinking. We see the world through objects. We do not see the world through interdependencies. Whereas Anishinaabe language, indigenous languages, 80% of them are verbs. They have a completely different formation of the world. And one of the challenges I think we face is actually this transition, if it's a deep structural transition in culture and also language and perception, that is a really big transformation. And the relationship with those things is going to be a foundational transformation, which we're going to have to invest in. And Europe has done that, right? So, Europe has been part of these theses. So the Enlightenment, whether it was Leonardo da Vinci and kind of the Vitruvian Man, quote unquote, was actually a conceptualization of a way forward. I think we have to reconceptualize and move forward And I think this is where machine economies, which is where I think there's going to be a whole piece of work around machine economies and human economies, and the relationship of those two things need not be the same. I think machine economies can operate in a fundamentally different way to what human economies operate like. And I think markets might be fantastic for certain things, but they may not be opportune for other things. I think we need to think about this through multiple layers on that cascade. And the other thing I wanted to put, why I like the term boundless, is I think too often, and Simone, you and I spoke about this quite a long time ago, I became very frustrated that actually people used to think of co-ops as an alternative to corporations. And I used to say, look, the problem that we face is that co-ops and corporations are exactly the same beast. They create an inside and an outside group. And the problem for us is that the problem is that inside and outside grouping is actually where the challenge is. Once you create an inside and outside group at a structural level, you will always set up these kind of competitive tensions. So if we want to transcend that, we have to create boundless or boundless systems, which are not built through boundary models, but actually grow in a fundamentally different way. And I think those are going to be critical. So these conceptual frames are really vital in terms of operationalizing a new economy, but they also transform how we see a house. They also transform how we relate to a piece of land. So for example, should you own land or should you be in treaty with land? So we're doing a piece of work re-examining that relationship. We're doing a piece of work re-examining actually trees and idea of trees being self-sovereign. How does that intersect with the world of spatial computing and distributed memory? How do these things start to come together to create a new type of world of micro many self-sovereignties? And how do we intersect in that world? So I think this is a foundational transition that we're in the midst of. And I think we're at the kind of cusp of that reality. So open that back up to you guys.
So Indy, do you see market-driven ecosystems, boundaryless as they may be, but populated with small micro-enterprises who are extremely focused and probably vulnerable? Do you see that as an advantage in terms of dealing with the issues that you're talking about? Or do you see this as leading to use a probably an inappropriate term, but do you see this leading to a sort of Uberization of society where everybody's without security and hustling for the next job?
My view is there's what I would say is a tendency of the system. So if we follow the current tendency of the system, then I think it drives us towards increasing precariousness and the increasing fragility of the individual, which at that moment in time drives a society built on fear, and that builds a politics which is built on fear, and I think it becomes a self-terminating reality. So I think it's a pretty limited road down that road. I think if we want to go further, I think we have to talk about, and I think Simone said this right at the beginning, that we have to talk about a new fundamental economy. And a fundamental economy, the foundational essentials, economy of essentials, has to be rebuilt in a kind of completely different way, because I think it has to be organized to unleash full human capacity and potential, and that is a different thesis. Now, that's why lots of people talk about universal basic income from a thesis of what I would call redistribution, all that sort of stuff. I'm actually more interested in UBI as a new economic thesis, as a mechanism to actually design to maximize human potential, as someone just elegantly wrote, to create the capacity to free people, to create the capacity to not free people from tyranny, but also free them to care. So I think it becomes a new form of infrastructure. And the question is that government, or is that actually multiple publics? And this, I go back to the kind of conversation that I think Thomas Diaz was having, that I think we often think of government and publics as a singular thing, and we need to think about government and publics as a multiple thing. So I think when we start to construct an economy of fundamentals, we have to talk about a multiplicity of publics that create that economy of fundamentals and essentials, because that's going to be critical. And that's where I think new types of organizations, material organizations like the ones that you speak of, can be designed to optimize some of that capacity in terms of being micro, but necessarily connected into transparent infrastructures. But there will be new economies of publics as opposed to new classical private economies, because the incentive systems are different.
Okay, Simone.
Well, Bill, I will leave it to you if you have another point that you want to explore.
Well, I'm wondering, so in the face of what you're talking about, Indy, what would an anti-fragile organization look like? How would it, and how far are we from being able to even think about something like that?
I think we have to be close. We have to be close. I think we have to talk. So, I mean, if I was looking at a deeply anti-fragile system, it would have to have fundamentally a different remuneration system, which isn't based on reward. It would have to be almost a personalized basic income or personalized income model, which is based not on reward, but almost like tenured professorship to effectively liberate people. I think it has to be based on the in and out group model, isn't a reward based performance model. I think you have to talk about a new form of the employment contract is out of date. I think the relationship of the organization to people that it works with, they need to be mission contracts. The thesis of governance that it employs has to be fundamentally different in terms of accountability. To system and public accountability models have to be fundamentally different. I think so. There's a whole bunch of structures that would need to be unpacked and repacked to build that. But I think those things are now visible, and certainly some of the technologies are in play. I don't just mean physical, mechanical and electrical technologies, but actually social technologies are increasingly in play. And I think those sort of frameworks are in play to be able to do that. I think the biggest challenge that we do have is that the cultural we're living in, we were born in a culture which is out of date to the relevance. And I think that cultural transition work is actually quite hard. So the kind of, whether it's the deep gender bias that we carry or whether it's actually other forms of biases that we carry, how do we create spaces? How do we actually create the spaces for the evolution and the tolerance for the system for us to be able to evolve? I think is going to be really challenging. And I think that's going to be probably the biggest challenge in the process. So I don't think there's a technology problem. I think it's actually a cultural transition problem, which I think is quite difficult. The other part is that the value creation at the other end of it, I think, is profoundly more, higher. So I think this is not a net zero-sum game. I think it's a quantum transition to a completely different form of value on the basis. I mean, I'll give you a very prosaic idea, right? The idea that one person can tell the other person what to do and be able to create chains of command seems a very poor use of what is the most extraordinary thing in the universe, which is the known universe, which is the human brain. The human brain is far more interesting than any computational capacity that we've ever built. But the idea that we create these linear models of command and control in a complex emergent world seems to be an anathema to the actual wonderful marvel of what it means to be human. So I think we have to start to de-link those power and control mechanisms, create new models of accountability, create new models of remuneration, create new models of freedom, create new models of frameworks and cultural transition as part of that process. But I think those are all visible and they're no longer what I would call far off in the horizon. They're visible parts of the transition.